Hello, my name is Janice B. Gordon. This is Scale Your Sales podcast. Welcome to the Scale Your Sales podcast, listed number 9 of 42 best podcasts for every sales professional in 2021. I am Janice B. Gordon, the customer growth expert, recommended by LinkedIn as one of 15 innovative sales influencers to follow in 2021. In today's episode, my guest talks about blue chair, red chair, and the table. This is how to improve your negotiation approach when we're talking to procurement. Now, as salespeople, we're always talking to buyers. So this is a particular skill you need to learn. But my guest also had this fantastic analogy on diversity. So make sure you listen to this episode. My next guest is founder of ROI 10, focusing on negotiations, procurement, and sales. He has worked for Mars Inc. for over 17 years in a variety of procurement functions. He is also lecturer of business economics at Fontys University of Applied Science and author of, and this is a brilliant book you all need to get hold of, The Other Side of Sales. So welcome to Scale Your Sales podcast, Mark Schenkis. So welcome to Scale Your Sales podcast, Mark Schenkis.
Correct, yeah.
Oh, really? All right, well, hey, we'll get that. This bit isn't in the main recording, but I wanted to test it out.
Okay.
So Mark, I'm particularly interested in, I really wanted to get you on to see The Other Side of Sales, which is the name of your great book that you've published. And I know with all your years of experience in procurement, this is something, and you know this because you've built the whole business around it, this is something that salespeople absolutely get wrong. So what is the main things that salespeople get wrong when they're approaching the procurement?
Yeah, I think this is I think the number one thing that I've experienced, and I've probably seen about probably about 1,000 plus salespeople throughout my career. It's like, and this is perhaps a bit traditional, you know, how salespeople used to work, is that they like to send information rather than ask. You know, I always say you have 2 ears, 1 mouth. I think that's exactly the ratio in which you should be using it. And I think salespeople still enjoy hearing themselves talk. Whereas, you know, if you listen to what a customer really wants, you get so much good value and information. I think that would be the number one thing throughout my career, basically, that I would address there. Yeah.
Listen, 2 ears, 1 mouth.
That's the ratio, exactly.
And I think that salespeople have the impression that procurement, they're difficult, they're non-compliant. I mean, that's obviously from a sales point of view. But why do you think that there is a real rub between the two? And it seems like there are two extremes.
Yeah, correct. Although, you know, there is not a real big difference between sales and procurement. I mean, we just happen to sit on the other side of the table, but we both have objectives to fulfill. We both have targets to achieve. We both know how to negotiate. We both have interpersonal skills. We both have families, you know, so we're not that different. We just sit on the opposite side of the table. And this is often where it goes wrong, because we tend to think from inside our own head rather than the head of the other person. And I think over time, you know, I think if I think about 20, 30 years ago, sales was like the number one function. They knew exactly how to do it. They were really skilled. They had good sales stories, sales pitches, and procurement was pretty much non-existent in those days. You know, procurement was not professionalized or not professional at all. I think that changed significantly in the last 20, 30 years. Yeah, procurement became a function. They started to focus on self-development. You know, they started to work on tools and stuff like that. And it became, you know, they often now have a seat at the table in boardrooms. So I think there's a huge difference, and that's a real complexity for salespeople. They don't know how to deal with that, you know, because procurement was so easy 30 years ago. They're very difficult now. And I think just sales hasn't evolved to the same level as procurement has over the last 30 years. And I think this is where most salespeople struggle. They just struggle to really understand the other side of the table. Yeah.
Well, your book does a brilliant job in bridging the two together. Now, tell me more about blue chair and red chair and the table. Can you explain the premise of this to actually help to improve the negotiation between sales and buyers?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's so simple that it makes it really a fantastic tool for people to actually use. And so when I talk you to October blue chair and red chair, I use the same terminology indeed in my book, where so a blue chair negotiation is a very cold negotiation. It's very, it's I think we call it a win-lose kind of negotiation. It's competitive. It's when you're buying something on eBay from another party. You just want to get the best price, and the other one wants to get the best price as well. So it's very much short-term, cold negotiation. Getting immediate results, often focused on price. A red negotiation, when you're sitting on the red chair, you're very much focused on the relationship. You're building something together. It's like when you're negotiating with your family where to go to on holiday, right? So you still want, after that negotiation, you still want a relationship with the other party. You still care about the other person. It's longer term. You want to think about win-win, because you don't want one to win and the other to lose, because they will not feel happy. So it's a very different approach in negotiation style. And the color of the table in the middle between both parties, so typically a buyer and the seller, they each sit on the chair at a table. The color of the table is determined by the color of the chairs. So if both parties would be sitting on the blue chair, you would have a blue table in between the both of them. It's simple. It's a very straightforward negotiation. It's just price and deal done. A red table, it's a bit more complex, but it's also when two people are on a red chair. Then you have a red table in the middle. It's really where you want to look at win-win, rather than if you have a piece of pie, you just a blue table, you're looking at who gets the biggest chunk. You're trying to cut up the pie. In a red table, you're looking at how can we grow the pie. How can we get more value in the relationship? Now, the complexity is when you're talking about blue chair and red chair. You have one party is on the blue chair and the other one is on the red chair. And this is where most people struggle, for obvious reasons. I'll tell you why in a second. Because the color of the table, and with the blue chair and the red chair, the color of the table is blue. And people don't often recognize that. And what happens when the table is blue, the blue party wins and the red party loses. Because red is thinking, I'm investing into a relationship and I want to build longer term partnership, etc., etc. And all blue thinks is I want to take and get more from me. These are the most difficult and most complex negotiations. Now, if I would ask any salesperson, so if you think about your complex buyers, what color chair do you think they sit on? They'll immediately go blue. Yeah, they're all blue, because they're tough. They only want to talk about price. But as a seller, you're often on a red chair. You do want to build that relationship. You do want to build a partnership with your customer. And this is where they get it wrong. And what the key thing is here is to recognize. I think it starts with recognizing that yes, you're on a red chair, the other party is on the blue chair, but the table is blue. I'm losing out here. And most people get frustrated. Most salespeople get frustrated by the fact, I can't seem to get through to the buyer. Correct, you can't, because the buyer has no incentive, to be red and make the table red. They have all the incentive to be blue because that's what they're focused on. And this is where I see most salespeople struggle. Yeah, when they're on the red chair and the buyer is on the blue chair, that's when it goes horribly wrong.
So how do you turn the buyer red? Yeah, because that's going to dictate the table. And it's interesting because salespeople think they dictate the table, whereas actually they're not. It's the buyer.
Yeah, actually both are dictating the table, the color of the table, because it's influenced by both. Because you can also have a buyer being red and the seller being blue. It's more uncommon actually in real life, but it does exist. So they both dictate the color of the table together. So when you are as a seller sitting on the red chair and your buyer is on the blue chair, you have two options actually. One option is indeed, as you mentioned, you want to try and get the buyer to sit on a red chair, because when you're both red chair, the table becomes red. So that's option one. The other option would be to become blue yourself as well. knowing I'm negotiating in a blue table, so I might as well be blue as well. However, both have consequences. So, if you want to decide to become blue yourself, it's easier because you are making that decision. It's something you actively do. However, it becomes cold. The relationship becomes cold. It becomes into a price negotiation. So it has consequences. Turning the buyer red is a bit more harder to do because it's something you can't influence. It's something the buyer has to do. So you need to get them motivated that red is a better chair to sit on than blue, which is not easy. That's hard. Yeah, and I think this is where most salespeople are actually struggling how to do that.
It's fascinating when you put it in such simple terms like this. Then you absolutely get it, because you mentioned the word incentives, and then the buyer is the buyer's in control of changing it, but they need a reason to change. And so actually the information you're giving the buyer isn't about the deal and the negotiation, it isn't about the table anymore. It's actually about the relationship and how you incentivize the buyer to decide to change.
Exactly. So, and that's exactly what it's one of your initial questions. What are the one things you should do is really focus on what are the buyer's interests, because if they don't have an interest to change color of the chair, you can try to move heaven and earth. It's just not going to work, right? So it's around finding out, what do I need to do to motivate a buyer to sit on a red chair? How do I create that kind of relationship? Because then you're negotiating at a red table, and that's when you get into like value building together and making a proposal that is actually fit for purpose for both parties. Yeah? Mm. I think this is the key thing, making the other party red. Yeah.
It's interesting. I was recording yesterday, and we had a conversation about incentivize. This was the customer, and the buyer is your customer. If you're a salesperson, it's still your customer, and actually standing in their shoes and really understanding their world and what their needs are and the pressures they're under. So sellers know to do that with buyers. Sellers know to do that with customers. They know they have to. And it's interesting why they don't just change the focus and do that with their buyers as well. When you think procurement, they're not thinking this is a customer, they're thinking this is a problem. Yeah.
I understand why.
It's a mindset change, isn't it, really? It's still your customer, and you need to understand their world, and you need to build a relationship with them as an individual. As you say, they have children and families, and they're just people.
Yeah, exactly. And and it's almost it's actually when you think about it, if I think about my 15 years in procurement, I've only once, and I literally mean I only had once in my life when a supplier came to me and asked me this question, which I think is so fundamental. And literally in 15 years, I had one supplier ask me this, is, Mark, what are your objectives this year? What are your objectives this year? What are you trying to achieve? Which I think is such a fundamental question, because if you don't even ask that question, how do you know what the buyer's real interests are? Yeah. You'll see tenders or RFPs being launched, but what are their real interests? What are they trying to achieve? Is it just cost? Is it payment terms? Is it service quality? What is it exactly, or innovation? You don't know unless you ask them. And I really, literally once in my lifetime, have I heard a seller ask me this fundamental question. Well, that's asking the question is one thing. I think the second part is the follow-up. What are you going to do with that? Because even if you ask that question, how are you going to make the buyer successful in their job? Which is a very different perspective that sellers usually have. They want to be successful in their job. And I think if you think about, if you make your buyer successful, you will become successful as well, because they will really value the fact that you're supporting them, and therefore they'll support you. That's how it works. Just these two steps, asking what are their objectives, and secondly, helping them to achieve those objectives. I think that's how you create. That's one of the options you do to create a red environment in the relationship.
Yeah. Fascinating. Really, really interesting, because it's something that sellers are doing with their customers. For some reason, as soon as you think procurement, you know, the gate comes down, and you don't think of them as customers in exactly the same way. Because if you were going into a customer environment, you would, nowadays especially, you're not selling a product, you're actually solving a problem, and the
Yeah.
problem has wider consequences within the whole organization. So you've really got to understand what is the business objective, and then the department functions, and who are the other stakeholders that are, you know, the decision making unit around the table.
Yeah.
And for some reason the mindset changes as soon as you think procurement.
Yeah.
And I think one of the problems that is the RFP, the tender process.
Yeah.
This is the barrier. How can we change that? Because no, I haven't met, I don't know about you, I've never met a seller that loves doing an RFP,
Yeah.
loves going through a tender process. They absolutely will do anything to avoid it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, sometimes you can avoid it. You know, if you have a really good relationship, sometimes you can't because it's company policy. So you know, you're absolutely right. They don't like it. And why don't they like it? Because it's a risk. It's a risk of losing business. And I know if there's one thing sellers are allergic to is just the thought of losing business. You know, because they have targets, and targets this year are higher than last year. So actually losing business means you need to, you know, fight hard to get back. And the thing with RFPs is that procurement has become much more professional at it. And one of the things they're doing is just saying, I'm the single point of contact in an organization. Yeah, that's what they say. So whenever they have an RFP process, they'll say, I'm the single point of contact. So don't reach out to anyone else except me. And there's a reason why they do it. I think this is a bit of interesting insight for your audience. There's a reason why they do it, because the rest of the organization is not as commercially savvy as buyers are. If you think about the entire organization, if you think about blue and red, buyers, when they launch this kind of RP, are very blue. I just want to get the best price, the best quotation out of this process. The rest of the organization, like all the internal customers within your customers' organization, they're very red. They want to build partnership and relationships, whether it's marketing or HR or IT or finance. They really want to work together, or supply or manufacturing, you name it. They really want to build a relationship with the supplier because it makes their lives easier. So they are very red. A buyer knows that their entire organization is red except them. So they feel like, I need to be a gatekeeper, otherwise, you know, they're going to be too warm and cuddly with my with my potential suppliers. So that's why they keep them away from everything. However, I think it's important to note that whenever there's an RFP process, it's never the buyer alone who makes the decisions. So it's always their internal customers are part of that decision-making process. So if you do have a good relationship, then it's important to, well, actually throughout, before the RFP process, to maintain that good relationship, because when a tender or an RFP process comes up, they're the ones rooting for you in that process. The buyer will say, hey, I have a great offer from supplier B. And the other ones will say, but we really enjoy working with supplier A. And that's exactly the kind of conflict you would like as a seller in that process, because otherwise you're going to have to be putting in the best price to satisfy the buyer. And actually, you do want this kind of conflict in that organization to make sure they're rooting for you, even though you don't have the best price. Because that's when all the other elements are coming into play. And it's never about price, quality, service, innovation, you know, just ease of doing business, invoicing process. There's so many more things that are important that the rest of the organization recognizes. A buyer does recognize, however, typically held accountable for savings towards the end.
Yeah, and that's a bit of a problem, isn't it? Because they're not the end user. And you can understand their role, that they will be rewarded on how much they can save the organization.
Correct.
So the finance love them.
Yeah.
But the actual end user, even within the customer organization, the relationship between, you know, I deal with sales leaders. So if they're buying something in from me and they have to go through this process, even they internally see this as a problem, as a barrier, as a block, because having to fight, they're not the procurement is not the end user. So the end user knows what type of quality and product that they want and feels that they shouldn't have to fight for it, because they're the ones that are using it. So how do you reconcile that? How can you you want that friction within the organization, but you actually want to work in your favor.
Correct. Yeah, and that's where you're not never selling just on price, because what a buyer typically does when they send out an RFP. Just put yourself into the shoes of a buyer. So they have an RFP. Imagine there's like 10 variables: quality, service, innovation, etc. And then there's price. How do you make a comparison? You can't. You can't really make a comparison, because how do you quantify quality? How do you quantify service? Like the difference between 95% service level and 96% service level. How do you quantify that? That's hard to do. And buyers agree it's hard to do. Yeah. So innovation is even more vague. You know, how do you put innovation, put a number behind innovation? But they have to use some kind of data to make comparisons. So how do you otherwise know that supplier A and B, you know, one is better than the other? Where do you base it on? So what buyers typically tend to do is they'll say, you know what, all these other factors, they're like equal. Yeah. So that makes it easy for them just to focus on price. Now, the rest of the organization doesn't agree to that. Yeah, for a buyer, that would be ideal. Just focus on price and the rest is pretty much equal. But the rest of the organization, no, this supplier has a better service here. So then it becomes a bit of a weighted discussion in the end. They say, okay, quality is 25% importance, service is 20% importance, price is 30% importance. And then they start weighing all those factors into the decision-making process. So, you know, I once had a supplier, I won't mention a name, internal clients, they provided excellent service, excellent quality. So they knew that whenever a tender or an RFP process came up, we would have to fight hard, you know, to convince our internal clients to move away, even though it was more expensive. They said, but they have such excellent service quality and everything else, I don't want to stop using them. And that's like exactly the kind of friction that you want to have. But in the end, then it would also be key, and I think that's answering your question, is to make sure that the buyer sees that added value, saying, yes, I know I'm a bit more expensive than some of the others. However, this is the reason why. And what I typically tend to do is, again, I'm trying to listen to my it's also I'm also in, I know I'm background in procurement, but running my own business, I'm also in sales now, which has proven to be an interesting insight. For me, the customer is always right. If they say, yeah, but I want it cheaper, I said, you can get it cheaper under my conditions. And my conditions means, I don't know, I'm going to reduce my service level. I'll have one less person in customer service. I'll have this and this. You know, if you want it cheaper, I can always get it cheaper. But then you don't have 24/7 service. You have 24/5 service or whatever, right? That's fine. If they say it's too expensive, say, great. What can I drop? I'm not saying no. This is the price. Should be no. What should I drop? Tell me. You know, if you want me to provide. If price is so important, I'll take stuff out. So they're never wrong. They're always right. It's just repackaging your proposals all the time to make it fit for purpose for everyone. And if you do it like this, then a buyer will have a hard time selling internally. Yeah, we've got a great price now, but service level has dropped, etc., etc., etc. Like, no, we don't want that, etc., etc. And then let them have that discussion. Let them start to validate what they want, because in the end, after that discussion, they'll come back to you and say, "This is what we want. All right, this is how much that costs."
Brilliant, love it. Absolutely love it. I mean, the ideal would be to understand what is the weighting, to understand who are the other competitors that are, submitting in the tender document. All of these, it's like state secrets, isn't it? No.
It is.
But if you have a good relationship, which is what you were talking about, Mark, if you have great relationships, you might be able to circumvent and get some of that information, you know who you're competing against and what their strengths are.
Yeah, well, finding out about competitors, that's typically the best kept secret by buyers, because they don't want people to know, not always, but mostly. I think understanding, how the decision-making process works, like, what is important. I think it's a very, very valid question to ask your buyers, saying, right, how are you going to make your final decision? What are some of the key elements you'll be focusing on? Because I want my proposal to meet your needs. Tell me what you're looking for. So it's actually quite a valid question. And as a buyer, I would have been open to share that with them, saying, all right, it's going to be based on this, and that. Yeah.
I suppose it's not being afraid to ask the questions. You may not always get the answer, but there's no harm in really getting as much information out of the buyer as possible.
Yeah, correct. No,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to change it up a bit because this has been absolutely fascinating. We always talk about diversity, but I don't know about diversity within the procurement in environment. You know, what does that, I know a lot about sales, but perhaps I'd love your perspective and whether things have changed and what is changing and if there's more that needs to be done.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, and my reference point actually is working at Mars. You know, the chocolate company. That's my 50-year background. I think, you know, I left Mars, but it's still a fantastic company in terms of diversity. You know, actually we had, I think, 60+% females in procurement in those days. So more females than men working in procurement, which I thought was really good. Also, actually, leadership teams were mostly female during the days that I worked, rather than males. So I think Mars has always been really great, you know, at managing diversity. They've been open about it, you know, they've been very transparent about it, all the things that they've done. But I see it, you know, there's still a long way to go, right? So let's be honest. It's not like something that's fixed, but it's not just Mars. It's anywhere in the world. But you know, baby steps, but I think it's moving into the right direction, and you know, I feel it's going into the right direction. But yeah, still some work to be done.
It's interesting. I wonder your view on the culture because of the makeup, the diverse makeup within, you know, Mars and companies like that.
Yeah. So when I was so how I explain diversity to people like diversity, and it's almost become a negative word, which I think it's ridiculous. It's actually a great word, but people don't see the real advantage of it. And how I say, like, if you're a person and you have to draw a circle, every circle is one person, and if you can create a team of people, are you going to draw 8 exactly identical circles so you get a really thick line? Because that's not diverse, right? It's just all the same people. Or do you make a nice painting where there's a bit of overlap, like, I don't know, in the shape of a flower, like a circle in the center, and all kinds. And that's what I love, because, you know, even as a leader, I think you're stupid not to focus on diversity, for the reason that, you know, whenever I had a project coming my way, because, you know, always stuff coming in, I was interested, like, who would be the best person for that? If I had 8 the same people, how do I find the right person for that? Like, I don't know, but if there's 8 different people, I could really use their strength, their background, age, experience, or not being young, or whatever. You know, you could look at it from so many perspectives. And I think if you're a leader and you're not advocating diversity, I think you're seriously missing out in getting more from your team, because there's always somebody good at something, right? And the more diverse your team is, the more you can get out of your team in the end. And I've always appreciated that. So, you know, I was always reflect, like, okay, who do I have in my team? You know, like half men, half women, half you know, older, more experienced, half young, different nationalities, you name it. There was always a mix of people, and that worked so well, you know, and I really enjoyed it, because in the end, as a team, we thrived as a result. We learned so much from each other. If you have 8 identical people, what's there to develop? You know, you're just seeing the same thing. And no, that really that really worked well for me throughout my career. Yeah.
I love your analogy. In fact, Mark, I might steal it. You know, the flower, and if you're doing a circle, what's the point in, you know, creating the same circle? I absolutely love that. So yeah, if you hear me, I will quote you. I got it from you. It's absolutely fantastic. It's really, I love the way you think and you talk. You're very visual with the, you know, the red chair and the blue chair, and it really just strips out the complexity and makes it really, really simple. So thank you very much for that. So Mark, if you're on a desert island on your own, what would be the one thing you would take with you?
Oh, that's a really good question. But I guess if I'm being extremely practical here, I would bring a survival guide or something like this, because I would not be very good at it. And you know, in order to survive, I think I need to get some water, some food, and shelter, and these kind of basic things. But I have no clue how to even make fire. So I think I would get just a book, a survival guide. I like books. I like reading a lot. You know, it's part of my development. So I think, you know, having something to read, but also something practical to read. Yeah. I think that would be very useful for me.
All right, the survival guide is on its way. We're going to make sure you're taken care of, okay, and you survive until you've picked up.
I hope not to ever strand somewhere, by the way, but that's another story. So I hope I'm not getting a one-way desert island or something. A desert island.
Well, now we know your worst fare, Mark.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how can listeners get hold of you, Mark?
Yeah, so various way. I think the easiest, if you just go to my website, which is www.roi-10.com. So ROI stands for return on investment, ROI 10, because I guarantee, tenfold return on your investment. So I'll make sure that you get at least tenfold the money you invest in me, a tenfold return on that, which is a hard guarantee. So ROI-10.com. You'll find all my contact details there, emails. You can even download the 10 insights for my book if you're interested in that, or just find a link to buy the book if you're interested in that. So yeah, everything is there that you need to know.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure speaking to you. I've learned so much, and I'll put all of the links in the show notes. So thank you for being a guest on Scale Your Sales podcast, Mark.
Yeah, thank you very much, Janice. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Scale Your Sales podcast. If you like this discussion, feel free to listen to other episodes or watch the captioned show on YouTube and subscribe to future episodes. I would really appreciate it if you would leave a positive review on iTunes. Thank you.